this house would institute. Yep. So the motion for this round reads: this house would institute quotas for men in university departments where they are underrepresented, such as veterinary sciences, psychology, education, teaching, etc. Without any further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to start the speech. Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, I have some internet connection, so may I like turn off my camera? Yeah, give me one quick second. PI in the chat, please. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Well, panels. In terms of this motion, we need to first come up with the contextualization, secondly, some substantive, and thirdly, some practical regard. Moving to the contextualization, I think firstly, the first thing to note here is that man in status quo are already be hindered or feel left out because of so many things that somebody like cultures for women, or like the rise of feminism in terms like the societal like level, in terms of the university level that exists for such a long time, right? The reasons for this is really simple, because women are actually being hindered for such a long time. That's to say the rise of feminism, for example, the like many activities like women in STEAM are actually being pushed out, being like push so many resources into these activities, right? That is to say, men actually in status quo are not being have like much quotas for them, right? I don't know even when the other side can say that our men already being favored in the society for such a long time, but this is actually because of this favor, because of this like stereotype or assumption that put into men. For example, men need to be like good at STEAM, men to be good at like computer science or math, or say you need to study mechanical engineering or doing any kind of engineering that exists in the status quo, right? That's the reasons why we see so many men, even when they don't like this like STEAM, or even when they don't like math, they supposedly by their parents, by their friends that, oh, you're good at it, that's why you need to follow this. They're being hindered from like following some like for psychology education, because that is considered just like for women only. Only women can like be good at this because they're likely to understand people more, they're likely to have like more sympathy, they're likely to teach children, they likely to like children, right? I don't know why this exists, but this is because of this favor towards men. That's like they consider men as like superior when they're smarter than women, like for such a long time. That's just man is being hindered from like following some like educated side that's considered as like inferior by society for such a long time. Second thing to note here is that even when the quotas, like we assume that quotas for women already exist, like for example, the women in STEM and any other activities, but I don't think it's never like it's not enough to break the prejudice that exists in the society, right? The reasons for this is that we actually favor women for a long period of time in many kind of activities. The feelings of being excluded from society, no one care about you. Even when you want to follow psychology, education, people are like, oh, you need to follow STEAM. People not giving you the chance to explain, but also because of the prejudice, like from really upon you, that you feel like, oh, you should not speak yourselves up, right? This policy is extremely important in terms of giving men the chance to study what they want, or in terms of giving them the chance to choose what they're like, having someone to support them out there. The third thing to note in the contextualization is that men joining like psychology education now, maybe like have some kind of like some people actually joining, but I think like they are extremely like privileged, or they actually like their parents are actually understand them, right? And I think like just like someone that's not good at joining education because you're not good at math, that's why you need to join the education, and people view you in a like much worse way in this school. But before we move on to other things, POI.
Are you sure that women are on the upper hand, or psychology is the only place where women can succeed, not in any other fields?
Yeah, I don't assume that women are more succeed in psychology or education than men, but the process or the incentives of women, or like the door that's open for more women than men in the States, for because there are so many things that support women. I think probably the other side I talk about, oh, we have like developing countries, the women are not supported enough. The problem is that things are already changes. We need to take into account the changes, even when it's like marginal, right? Even when in countries that have like previously pharaoh system that only allow men to work or go outside, like Muslim countries. Sorry if that like trigger you, but I think just take it as example, right? People are actually take some changes. Only the previous like generation actually hindered their like women to go to school. This thing is actually changes within, like they realize the inequality exists. Therefore, they're likely to support the victim within the society more. That's why men being excluded more. Up until this point, the model case recently actually increased the participation by having like man like secure exact slots for men in the university. Also, is like marketing or showing how successful man is the like in the department, or showing how like man is also like suitable for the department. We're showing that our equality exists in this like department as well. That's why you incentives like men to join many like psychology education teaching more. Coming to our case, I think the two things notice how we break the stereotype exists, right? The premises for this example, we need to show them that our society actually supporting you, the government is supporting you, uni is supporting you, right? Because actually the uni department can decide which like how students view their like career for such a long time, right? When the universities or like someone like university can show them their parents that are man is totally fine to join psychology or education, will actually declare that there's actually slots for men in the education and this department as well. Let's say we allow men to join this at the very first place. We lower the barrier entries, right? When boys can tell your parents that our university opened a slot for me, it's not just like go and join this. It's not like majority goes in my department, because obviously, because if like they are like parents with like some prejudices, they like to tell the boys that their children that it's you're not likely to join this because they're own woman in this department. You should draw some steam out there, right? It's extremely important in terms of showing these people some kind of support, even when it's marginal. That's they actually feel like it's okay for them to join this. It's totally fine, and we need to normalize the fact that men can join this too. The second thing is how we better for the department as well. The premises is that actually we are actually favored like still favor like policy because men are there, right? We are underfunded in this psychology education because they're not important, because they are actually like easy to join, right? It's really important here because we actually have like balanced amounts of men and women join this department. It's okay for society to support that. It's likely we have more like voices within the department, because previously only women support like raising the like trying to increase the salaries of teachers, right? But now men can join in this, have equal balance of power. We increase the natural in terms of supporting the movement, supporting inequality exists within the department, and also like the future career. We're likely to win with it. And for this reason, I'm proud to standing opening government.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for side opposition. Also, just to note before O starts that case, I will be putting timestamps in the chat if I can, although I would encourage the speakers to time themselves. And in case someone does not want the timestamps, then please tell me before you start your speech. Over to you, Leader of Opposition.
Hello, just want to confirm that I'm clear and audible.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nicole. Pronouns are she, they. For POIs, please send them in chat. If I don't take you by 5, feel free to unmute. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think government needs to be faulted for how unclear their model is. How significant is this quota exactly? Because we think in opening opposition, if it's a small number like 10% or 5%, that simply means that their effects are probably going to be marginal and men are still going to be underrepresented in these fields. But if it's a significant number like 50% or a large number like 75%, then we say congrats. You've regressed so far back that you've made a field that was historically women's refuge in the workforce into a male dominated field, and you've probably set back a lot of progress in terms of getting women represented in labor in general or giving them the same opportunities that men have in status quo. Few responses to the previous speaker. First, they said that men are being excluded and hindered by their parents and society, who say that they should be in a specific career path or they're held to a certain level of success, like that's why you should only go to things like engineering and stuff. First, we think this is largely symmetric because we think that the active coercion by parents will still exist on their side. Just because your university said that you need to have like 100 males within this major, I don't think that we improved how these men are probably going to get self-actualization on their side and why that's so important and how they're able to appeal to these parents anyways when they're so set on the idea that these are feminine fields and like women dominated stuff later. But secondly, they said that we need to show better support for men and that they're able to choose to get into these programs because we lower the barriers for entry. First, I don't think there's a need to lower the barriers of entry because all these men have all these opportunities and resources at their disposal, as opposed to women who have historically had to fight for the right to education, who have historically had to fight who are constantly being held at a higher standard than their male counterpart in terms of any field. You have to reach a higher level of success for you to get the same recognition and the same prestige that they have normally, regardless of how bare minimum they're able to fulfill anyways. But secondly, I think this is bad on the idea that it defeats the principle of meritocracy. That we would even posit that it's unclear because we think that the characterization of the quota was unclear. So it's not assured that these men uh, probably have the capacity or the requirements that they're able to fulfill. There won't be a guarantee of an examination or a screening process that's able to ensure that these things are going to happen. Because to fulfill that quota, that probably means two things. First, you're lowering the barrier of entry. That means you're lowering the standards to be able to enter into these fields. So that means that you're generally messing with the quality of people who are able to get into it. That's probably future doctors, future veterinary, future psychologists. We're still pretty significant in status quo. But also, secondly, that means you're holding men to a higher level of importance as opposed to everyone else who's wanting to get into admissions and stuff like that, right? Their last claim was that, oh, by having men in these majors, it probably means that they're going to support the movement and stuff like that. First, I don't necessarily see how that can accrue in status quo wherein there's still this stigma around these majors, but also the idea that they're automatically going to be these helpful allies that are able to lobby for things. We don't necessarily get how these things can't happen in status quo when you see women who are succeeding, when you see women who are able to meet the same level of success that men are able to meet in other majors. So first case, why it's unjustified. We think the first level to this argument is a historical analysis because we need to question why men are underrepresented in these fields in the very first place. We agree that these fields are centered around reproductive work that assumes things like routine and care and are commonly associated with traditional feminine traits like empathy, care, etc., etc. Like these things have historically been things that men avoided in general because they feel like it's menial labor. They feel like it's insignificant work that they're higher than these things, and being able to opt into these kinds of fields would probably mean that they're lowering their level of success and stuff like that. But we think the problem with the quota is that women have been historically deprived of educational opportunities and locked out of traditionally male dominated fields. That's why they flock to these career paths in the very first place. That's why men are largely underrepresented in these career paths because it was the only option available to these women back in the day and stuff like that, right? But we think the quota for women in male dominated fields is much more preferred given that it already exists or given that it probably doesn't exist as something that that we should prioritize anyways. Like it's much preferred since it has the same effect of being able to debunk optics that certain career paths are only for men or only for women to a higher regard in fields that they're underrepresented. But it also means that we're able to give women the affirmative action that they deserve in these fields, right? Because second level, how does the quota work? This probably means that universities and employers would have to go the extra mile to be able to market these majors and departments to men since they're already underrepresented in these fields. But this also means that it's perfectly justified for opposition to claim that there's very little demand for these majors among men in status quo. So government cannot simply claim that there will be a significant increase in the interest and representation, or the stigma is suddenly going to go away when you have these quotas anyway. Because we think that when they said that it's creating incentives for men to join in marketing it, okay, sure, CG.
Quotas increase representation in underrepresented industries, forcing interactions and challenging gender stereotypes. What's the trade-off here?
I think that these incentives and making sure that people have interest in these things doesn't necessarily can still happen without the quota, because the quota is simply a guarantee that you're going to have that number in it, but it doesn't necessarily give you leeway to assume on government side that people are suddenly going to be interested in these things anyway. So we don't get the incentive mechanism for people to opt into this anyways, and it doesn't really answer the question of what happens if universities are unable to meet these quotas and stuff like that, right? But secondly, we think that the best case in this is just to increase screen time, or like make sure that people are exposed to these fields. But these things can happen without the quota anyways, so we don't necessarily get how the marginal benefit on government is going to be significant in this debate, right? Because what kind of optics is a quota manufacture? A quota assumes that underrepresentation of men is the most pressing issue in education. It implies prioritization for the policy to be effective, because you have to ensure that they're interested and create mechanisms for them to stay that major and field anyways, for you to have any sort of success on your side and force interaction, stuff like that, right? But this also assumes the same level of importance as affirmative action for women, gender minorities, and racial minorities, because it places men at the same level of these people. It places men at the same level of prioritization in terms of admissions and stuff like that, and grade retention. And that's bad because of the power imbalance that men have compared to these people. We think affirmative action shouldn't be for men, it should be for people who are underrepresented in other fields as well. Thanks.
I would like to thank the leader of opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to invite the TPM to continue the case for side government. Yeah, here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. I prefer audible PIs. I'll probably take one at 5. If not, please call out. Give me a second. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I'm in an awkward position to call it opening opposition for not only being misogynist, but also probably being misandrous when they're saying that all men are privileged and therefore like they disregard the struggles happening on with men. What we're saying is that we will not only benefit those men who are currently like actually oppressed under this patriarchal system, but we also, by pushing these men into the educational system and into these, for example, humanities and university departments, we can also gradually break the gender stereotype, and that is how we can also benefit women, which opposition didn't actually engage with. I want to rebuttals integrated. I want to talk about 3 things. Firstly, how we actually break gender stereotype. Secondly, the mechanism of how men will join anyway, and I think this also prevents closing opposition from probably just saying that men will not join, so there's no delta. And lastly, we will also prove that even if like men don't join, or like not enough men join inside, how we can actually still like break gender stereotype, and how that's still better off for women. Before that, I want to note that 2 pieces of framing here. Firstly, I want to clarify that our model of instituting quotas probably means like, I don't know, 5 to 10% of women. It's not going to be like 90% and then you crawl out all women. I think opposition's counterfactual here is being really unclear, because they said they're going to support women quota, but their response to our quota literally is when you lower barriers, you lower the quality. Like then why do you also have quota that exists, right? We say when it's just like 5 to 10%, there will still be competition because there will still be more people wanting to join in, right? Second, and very important piece of framing here is that gender inequality is also harmful to men. I think opposition has a very like naive understanding of what gender inequality looks like. They probably think it's just about hierarchy, just about all men being better than men, than women. But we say gender inequality is more like a social construct when stereotype and barriers are intertwined. This looks like two things. Firstly, there's intersectionality within men. That means you still have things like privileged men, you still have men with different tendencies. We think when opposition probably just says that all men are very like are better in not only STEM but also in education, and therefore they're gonna like crowd out anything. It's just unfair, right? Secondly, I think it's very like they have misandry to say that men struggle in the educational field. It's not a problem because like, and they give me historical lesson of how men are just doing that to avoid femininity. We say like regardless of the history, the status quo is just these men are pressured into going to STEM because they think it's more lucrative. It's not just lucrative though. It's also like it's more masculine for so these men, even if they have better tendency to join psychology, for example, they still cannot join. I don't see why this is not important compared to women who cannot join STEM, right? But we say that if their mechanism is that men want to avoid femininity, so like in the status quo, even if they're underrepresented, it's okay. We say why women are discriminated against in the first place is exactly because of this narrative that femininity is bad. So on opposition side, you just reinforce the idea that femininity is bad because you're saying that men shall not be helped because probably when you're a man, that means you have the masculinity and that means you're privileged. We are breaking this barrier and saying that even if men have some kind of trace of femininity, they can still succeed, and that for like and therefore vice versa, and saying that masculinity and femininity are not something that's hierarchy, right? Thirdly, we say that in the status quo, quotas for women are just not enough for two reasons. Firstly, I think there's just limited capacity for STEM, right? So opposition's policy is probably that you can have like quotas for women in STEM. But the problem is you cannot get everybody to stuff into STEM and get everybody to succeed. Women even if like women have the same talent as men to also join STEM, the historical education that they have got, or like the education they have got when they are starting from a young age, at least in the status quo, means that it's very unlikely for them to actually succeed and prevail in the STEM, even if they get in, right? But even if they do succeed, it's still very likely that lots of women still cannot get in STEM in the first place. So we need to like increase quotas in other places, right? But second, I think gender dichotomy on their side still exists. That is the inherent idea that STEM are better for women, better for men, and that therefore it's better. The status quo, the gender stereotype in the status quo, which brings me on to the first point, is just very harmful because it not only creates societal pressure for men, but also for women, right? And we say the problem is that on opposition side, when you disregard the societal pressure for men, it's actually unclear how you can actually solve women's social pressure for women to the roots either, because you need to like have a more balanced distribution of different like genders into different departments to actually break this barrier, to actually get women move on. But secondly, I want to talk about how men will actually join on our side. Before that, any POIs?
Theo,
Okay.
even if men are pressured, why does any of your case matter in compared to all of the historical and current sufferings onto women that are still going on to a really huge extent?
Because we just proved to you how women can actually be better on our side. Like it's a net positive on our side. We're not sacrificing women. Okay, that brings me on to my second point, how men will actually join this and how this is better overall, right? I think on opposition side, the stereotype will still exist, and on government side, we are the team that are actually breaking this stereotype. We also told you in our model that we're having things like propaganda while allowing some men to consider this opportunity, and therefore they don't get in. Opposition is gonna say men still want to still join STEM, but we told you that there are different kinds of men, like in terms of this male group, right? That means those who probably don't do well in STEM anyway, those who are not that interested in STEM, those who probably have more femininity will still join them. And we say, firstly, this is good for them because they probably aren't going to succeed at STEM anyway. But secondly, we also say this will not shroud out women because these men are probably like people who are a bit less privileged in the first place. They're not the ones you see like scientists or like those who have received lots of like science education when they were young, and therefore they're not going to crowd out of women. If you say so, I think you're like actually inherently misogynist, right? But thirdly, we say that even if men don't join, it's still better because we can benefit women by firstly getting women more chance for them to study STEM. So like even if there are just 5 to 10% of men joining the education system, it necessarily means that for STEM, they can have more space for women to join in the first place. But secondly, we also say that like as long as some men join these campaigns, it's better for them to argue for things like labor rights, because we do understand that in the status quo, masculinity has some kind of privilege. And that means when there are, for example, male teachers or male psychologists also joining women's campaigns and like advocating for better working rights, for example, it's easier for them to actually break gender barriers or get some kind of like benefits that cannot trickle down to all women. The third thing we say is that we can at least break the inferiority of humanities, because we say that there are more students and now inside this educational system, but also more funding. So there's a signaling effect to proving how psychology or education, for example, is not something that is just feminine and it's not something that is just inferior. I think that's overall we can actually remove the stigma for women as a whole, and therefore we not only benefit men but also women. So proud to propose.
I would like to thank the DPM for that fine speech, and I would like to invite the PLO to continue the case for side opposition. Here.
Hello, can I just confirm that this is clear and audible?
Yeah, you're perfectly audible.
All right, thank you so much. Just to reiterate, I do not consent to recording.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with OG is that the claims they make are very beneficial and impactful, but they are very assertive with very little mechanistic analysis as to how those things come into play. Closing government will provide the mechanism proving that these benefits exist under a quota. Specifically why a quota is going to work by getting buy-in. The second is how a quota reduces pressure on male-dominated industries and indirectly help women. And thirdly, why quota challenge gender stereotypes and the stigma associated with these industries being less preferable or like inferior compared to others. The first extension are all responses integrated. Why are quotas going to work? I think as OG is correct to point out that there's a subset of men that are on the fence. You have probably people that have different interests, have multiple different interests, for example, but probably moved in favor of other jobs like STEM-related fields because there's stigma associated with jobs like nursing or joining psychology. This means that these kind of people are more likely to join under this specific policy because they can say, there's a quota available here. So it's not that I'm choosing to go to an inferior job. It's that there exists an opportunity here in this particular regard. And I think that the fact that there is availability, this means that it's more likely people that do have interest that would otherwise not be willing to join in the counterfactual, who are more likely to join under outside the house. There's already positive delta there. The second is that I think universities are going to provide incentives to join, because obviously a quota is something that they have to meet, right? Which means that university can provide things like scholarship, like fee discounts, like package deal. All of these things increase the incentive for these men to join the field. The third thing is that we'll parallel this to like pro-women quota and affirmative action in literally every other field, as what opening opposition points out themselves. I think states do offer subsidy to empower these kinds of things and ensure that these things are effective. And even in cases where they don't work, for example, so long that universities have demonstrated a reasonable effort to try to reach out and make those things available, I don't think they'll be punished. So I'm not sure why quota is not working out as a problem in this particular debate. In the long term, I think they just generally looking at organic trends towards change, like just weakening of gender stereotypes. I think a quota hastens this and accelerates this social change, but it also means that in the long-term future, more people are going to opt into this kind of female-dominated industries as they are right now, which means in the future, this quota may not necessarily even be needed in the first place. So I just think that all of these things prove that the quota system is there to accelerate change that is already happening, but more importantly, change provides the incentive structure to overcome the societal stigma that exists right now. There's a mechanistic quibble in the opposition about how how big is this quota going to be? And I think the answer to this is just basically the quota is just going to be large enough to incentivize the influx of men into the industry. So if like very, very female-dominated industries like nursing, for example, where only like 0.3% of those people are men, I think we can increase the quota to make it like 1%. If the percentage is 5 to 10%, I think we increase it to 15%. And obviously we can have annual reviews to like review whether a quota or whether we want to increase the quota or whether a quota is even still needed at all. I don't think this mechanistic is the issue. The last thing under this thing here, I just want to weigh all of this against the DLO's alternative things like scholarships for etc. I'm happy to concede there'll still be some men that join this industry in your side of the house. They question the extent to which this happens, because I think you will not be able to deny there's a positive comparative on our side of the house with regard to quotas providing incentive as well as the means to incentivize more people to join the industry. So just comparing efficacy, our side provides the state legitimacy of state policy that legitimizes these things, necessarily making it more effective on our side of the house. I'll take your PO in a bit. First point of extension extension, why do you think this is particularly good for women, especially in other industries? The first thing to note is that quotas for men in female-dominated industries is likely to increase the influx of men into those industries for all the reasons I talked about earlier. This necessarily means there are less men going to STEM fields, especially those men that are just like incompetent and just there because they think that nursing and psychology are inferior. This means that just a lot less pressure of women that want to go into those STEM industry, but constantly face like gender-based discrimination, for example. We're sure there are quotas that do exist, but are probably insufficient to deal with the like misogyny that still exists within those particular industries. I think a quota that directs men out of STEM industries and into female-dominated industries is also going to relieve the pressure on women to go into those male-dominated industries and make it easier for them to do so, especially those that are meritorious and have the qualification to get in. But the opening opposition says, the first thing is that women are crowded out in fields where they are female-dominated under a quota policy. The first thing to note, this is unlikely to be true because such fields generally are understaffed because men have a tendency of avoiding it entirely. But since at the same time, a lot of women want to go into STEM, so they don't want to go into fields like nursing, which is why there generally is a supply gap or like a lack of supply in this particular regard. So I think the quota is just likely to meet that particular demand. It's unlikely to crowd out women as the opening opposition says it to be true. It also says women are, even if that's the case, if women feel pressured to leave the industries or like courses like psychology, for example, they're more likely to go into STEM industries or like find other jobs. So I don't see why that's specifically a problem. Even if there's a trade-off that some women are going to lose out, I think the trade-off is worth it because the value of representation and interaction creates greater value than that last 5 or 10 women joining that specific industry and or like feeding into gender stereotype and the stigma that continue to exist. Women crowded out can always go into other sectors. In absolute worst cases, they cannot find employment, they can't get welfare, the same as men who are crowded out by female-friendly quotas in male-dominated industries. I'm not sure but the nature of just how quota works, you need to go beyond that to explain why these quotas specifically are harmful. Before I go on to why this is good for representation, I'll take opening opposition.
So why would men suddenly not be interested in STEM if there is a psychology slot, if opening government tells us that men historically see this as female-dominated jobs?
No, the point is that there's generally a random distribution of like IQ, intellect, and interest in fields, right? It's just that people, number one, usually have multiple different fields that they're interested in, but number two, have a tendency to cave into social stigma by the virtue of patriarchal norms being very coercive. So those men who do have interest or who have multiple interests that are choosing between the two are likely to opt for psychology on the outside path when there's a quota, there's state legitimacy, and also when universities offer incentives for you to join. That is net difference that you cannot capture in opposition. Final extension, why do you think it's good to increase representation? By O's own characterization, right? These are industries that are probably more care-based industries, require emotional labor, empathy, etc. Men often see as inferior because we aren't good at this like emotional kind of thing. I think this is good for 3 reasons. The first thing is that this challenges patriarchal stereotype that men cannot be effeminate, that men cannot be emotionally available, that men cannot be caring people. So it directly shows an increase in the number of men going into those industries. And I also think that the way that men are socialized are often not to be very empathetic. Going into those industries directly gives them the lived experiences of being more empathetic and being more caring. I think this is a great thing for emotional awareness for the male gender as a species. The second is that it forces interaction, right? Specifically with regards to things like empathy, being more caring, also understanding the lived experiences that their female counterparts go through on a day-to-day basis. Because if you go to a psychology course in university, you have to interact with other like female friends there, right? Which means you can witness the microaggressions that they face, the kind of engendered stereotype and misogyny that they face. There's a direct lived experiences that if you don't work in the same industry, you're very unlikely to have in the counterfactual. The OG asserts that you get more political capital for change without necessarily explaining why. I think we explain specifically why the benefits of representation means men are more aware about the lived experiences of the women and are more likely to make change. In the absolute worst case, they're discriminatory. I think it's easier for women to call them out because they're just the majority in those places. For all of those reasons, quotas are massively beneficial. Your proposal.
I would like to thank the member of government for that statement, and I would like to invite the member of opposition to extend the case for side opposition. Here.
Hi, I prefer my POIs in chat, so I'll rather not be interrupted during my speech. I start my speech in 3, 2. Now, this debate is not about men, but about women. There are 3 reasons as to why this is true. Firstly, women are the most vulnerable actor, as most people do agree reading the scroll. Secondly, it's a comparison between having a choice and not having a choice. Men have choices in other lucrative industries, for example, STEM, as they said, or in other jobs. Whereas women, what can women be? Nannies, housewives? Because all of the other industries are so much worse for women. And even if, let's say, it drives some women in there, the possibility of success is just so low compared to psychology, women do not have a choice. Third reason, men are growing up with more educational opportunities. Of course, because of the implicit biasness where men are more likely to get scholarships or men are more likely to get the support within the education system, this already puts men at a massive advantage in compared to women. This means that men are more likely to get any scholarships and more likely to get any of these jobs. These three reasons conclude why women are always the most vulnerable actor that has to be concluded. Even in the worst case scenario where some men are disincentivized from joining psychology, we see on CO that we do not care because women are the ones who historically oppressed. This means that we take out the entire OG case because OG's case is premised upon man is suffering and gender inequality being onto men. However, I think that this is not true because of the previous reasons, but note the shift in their case. After the POI, DPM said that men being pressured matters because it benefits women when men are also benefited. This means that despite the first speaker of OG talking so much about how it harms men, the premise of their case is because if it benefits men, it benefits women. However, we're not sure how it benefits women either because OG didn't have sufficient explanation. They said that you have more space for women in STEM, but as themselves say, if non-privileged men aren't in the STEM field in the first place, and if those in STEM are already the privileged in the first place, this means the net amount of people going in STEM is not influenced on either side of the house. Therefore, neither OG or CG proves how more women can go into the STEM field. With that being said, I think it's clear that women are the core of this debate, and OG never proved how they benefit women either. Moving on to CG, they had an interesting extension on saying how this makes men more caring. However, on the first thing about interaction, I think it's very clear that we do interact with women in most circumstances, in any workspace, or even in school. 18 years of your life interacting with women, I am unsure as to why the additional 3 years is something that has a net change on how men interact with women. I think this is something that WIP has to explain, but it's already too late. Then they say it changes men to become more caring to a certain extent. However, I think we have to point out that this is just a small amount, 5% or 1% as TJ said, going into this industry. We're unsure as to how this changes the overall demographic of men. But even if that's the case, I think that the net here is that if you want to make men more caring, you can have awareness campaigns. You have a lot of other alternatives. They have to prove why it is just to take away the opportunities of women or force women into other industries just to make men a little bit more caring. We don't think we want this. With that being said, there are 3 things I'm going to talk about in my speech. Before that, I'll take CG.
Yeah, so the crowding out effect is the same problem with having quotas for females in STEM-based industries. That's something that you're willing to support.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So if you put quotas, right, you have more men there, necessarily some women lose jobs. It's the same problem with quotas for women in STEM industries. Some men lose jobs. Isn't that a symmetric problem?
No, I've explained why women is the most important actor, so we should always protect women first. So firstly, let's break this deadlock on whether it breaks the stereotype or not, because this is the most largest assumption on OG and CG. So does it break the stereotype? We think no, because as OG say, those who have a trace of femininity can still succeed in psychology and in education. This is the problem, panel, because you further perpetuate that only men with more femininity can succeed within the psychological field. If that is the actor that they want to talk about going into education, which we think that we have to assume this is true to a certain extent, coming from OG. Therefore, you further characterize and segregate men. We think this then, if their premise is on benefiting men, it further harms men. We say that those with femininity cannot succeed in STEM and has to go into psychology in their side of the house. But does men being in the industry actually break the stereotype? No, it breaks the stereotype on men being unable to succeed in psychology in their best case, but it doesn't prove that women can succeed in STEM. And this is the largest problem because we're talking about women who cannot succeed in any other industries. So even if you break the stereotype and say that men can succeed in psychology as well, this doesn't prove women being able to succeed in any other industries. This means that women are always trapped in psychology as well. This means that whatever they do never harms, never benefits anything. But here's the unique mechanism that we provide from CO. We think you further perpetuate the stereotype because this is the narrative that nobody of the male gender is interested within psychology. This is when the government or when the universities are, no thank you, all the ones setting is to say that because no men are here, we have to set this. The counterfactor is organic change, which is already happening with the status quo. When this changes slowly, when more women and men are changing these roles. But the massive harm here is when universities themselves say this, when themselves say that men are not interested and men are inferior within these industries. This is when they further perpetuate the stereotypes. This is really important because note that being able to implement this doesn't mean that you have the fiat to say that this remains. So insofar as you perpetuate the stereotype, this can be overturned in any scenario, and this causes further harms on men and further harms on the stereotypes. Secondly, let's talk about which is better for the department, because they say that you will have more funding to a certain extent. I think that we have to point out that the reason why this industry is already getting a lot of funds, not because women are inside, but because these industries are incredibly important. I'll take OG before I go on.
Told you that there's a men that underprivileged as well. They're told that they need to follow STEAM, that only STEAM can bring them jobs. How can deal with underprivileged men that exist because of the increase of feminism in the as well?
Yeah, these men are further harm on your side of the house because you further characterize that these people are different and these people with a trace of femininity needs to go into psychology and cannot succeed in STEM. Those who then still are unable to go into STEM are then go into psychology are massively harmed on your side. But let's go back on why they will get funds. Because these careers are really important because it's premised upon the succeeding of society. You need to educate the younger generation. So for any country at all, you will want to focus on the current generation. Therefore, having men is not a net change. But the problem here is that men are not raised in a way that they were suited for the profession. I think that oftentimes these men are not yet that qualified in compared to women whenever you have a quota. This is then massively important because this harms the patients on their side of the house. It harms the children, which are the education of tomorrow. This is massively important because psychology is premised upon the life and death of someone with mental health issues. And this is the debate winning point because this moves above the debate on men and women and actually focuses on the profession. With that being said, we don't believe that psychology is a field when you can experiment on quotas. We need to prioritize the patients. And furthermore, we don't think they benefit men or women either.
I would like to thank the members of opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to invite the government whip to conclude the case for side government. Yeah, here.
All right, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible, loud and clear.
All right, I'll take POIs verbally. I'll take one from opening if there's like any, but if not, closing is symmetrically fine. All right, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. We do agree with closing opposition's characterization and framing about how women is an existentially important stakeholder in this debate. So if we can prove exactly on the side of closing government, the women is best empowered, and presumably we also take it above them anyway. So irrespective of who's important, she's going to win all of them out. I'm going to talk about 2 things in this speech. First, on which side of the house are women best empowered, answering closing opposition's framing on this. And second of all, I'm going to talk about on which side of the house do best remove gender stereotypes. On the first issue, then in terms of the women empowerment and like on which side of the house can women get more representation. Well, we told you that there's 2 things. The observation right here is that opposition bench, both opening opposition and closing opposition, suggests that it actually harms and actually disperses women in this particular case because there's some increase in some influx of men within these forms of industries, then literally these women, literally the majority of women will suddenly be replaced out of a sudden. There's a number of reasons in particular why this is untrue to begin with. The first is that we'll utilize opening opposition's own characterization and weaponize it against them. Because opening opposition's characterization right here is literally that these industries, things like psychology, things like healthcare, things like caring, for example, automatically requires and mandate significant amounts of empathy and significant amount of care and like of patience, for example. Realize that I think all teams in this debate eventually agree that these jobs are specifically made and designed for women. There's 2 reasons why. First is that also just biologically in itself, it suggests that there's a lot of studies out there suggesting that in fact that women in itself is more patient compared to men. This is not gender stereotyping because literally this is a fact. But second of all, the fundamental reason as why this is a female dominant industry in itself is because specifically women can do it and literally excel superior compared to men within these industries. So it is unclear why in a female dominant industries where predominantly the majority of women are likely to excel significantly superior compared to the men, that these men suddenly are likely to be these men who are simply like who have a comparatively less amount of patience or comparatively less caring biologically are likely to suddenly replace all of the women within these forms of industries to begin with. But his second response to this is just that it's still would impose quotas in STEM industries or like other male dominant industries anyways. So even if there's some loss of jobs in our city house within these female dominant industries, we suggest it's insignificant because then probably find jobs and acquire jobs in other industries or other male dominant industries anyways. The factor is that the difference is unlikely to be significant. The push in your opposition bench in this debate is immensely ridiculous. Let's look at what TJ's explained in his speech. The first thing he explains is they actually spark interactions between men and women within these forms of industries because literally your colleagues will interact on a daily basis, and this trickles down to the very fundamental amounts of change because now you make and form strong emotions with these forms of women. The concern of the closing opposition was, but we still interact with women in school because like guys and girls still have some form of interaction in schools and other factors, and we still have things like awareness campaigns. But still, it is in a stage where you're still learning and your worldview is not constructed. So perhaps you have like, I don't know, you have like girlfriend of like, you have like female friends back in high school. It is unclear in particular as why their existence automatically make you think the women in entirety is too powerful because at a particular point in time, you're still learning. You're still at an age of trying to perceive and learn new things. It is like literally, it is unlikely to have a perception about how the world actually functions. You're probably still not that aware about like gender stereotypes. You're still probably not aware about about like women suffering and etc. So it's unclear particularly why the stage of high school you're likely to receive and you're likely to accumulate such a large amount of empowerment on your women. But literally, this is factually does not work because the status quo we're living in right now, if we agree that it's patriarchal, then all these mechanisms are already in place. What closing opposition essentially needs to understand and needs to answer in this second speech is why exactly is that in the presence of all these mechanisms and in the presence of all these things already exist, why is women still disproportionately treated, and why is the empowerment of women still needed in this debate? That is exactly because your position and power to which they're comparatively weaker. That is why we need to solve them in this debate. But second of all, there's no direct capacity to envision women's capabilities because it's only in our side of the house where you actually see women shine in these industries, where they're significantly better in terms of statistics and data, like that data they're able to reflect compared to men in these industries. It is only plausible where discourses are likely to spark when men finally understand, when men suddenly finally start to perceive and understand as women as being capable within at a particular point in time. It is only plausible and specifically on our comparative where gender stereotypes are going to reduce at some point in time. That's where there's going to be the entirety of the opposition bench in this debate. If they're concerned about true about how women are going to disproportionately lose jobs and like get displaced out of a sudden, we'll suggest there's a marginal increase for the reasons already given. But even if there's, but we'll suggest that we're willing to make a trade-off right here because it is unclear what the four women being unemployed in these industries in exchange for a societal discourse that is likely to spark an our side of the house, which significantly elevates and uplifts the entirety of women in a society on a scale will suggest the impact is significantly larger because you uplift the entirety of society versus the couple of months of women that we're very happy to trade off upon. And we suggest the second layer here is that the reason is why these women are less important is because the factor is they can lose jobs on both sides of the house, things like unemployment because of the COVID, etc. The point is that employment exists and it happens on a daily basis. We suggest it needs to come secondary to TJ's extension. The discourse argument is indefinitely important because it also weighs up opening opposition's concerns about things like women being fractured. So but the last reason is why this actually wins us is to understand that retrospectively, because all the end goals of the House in this debate is to empower women except for opening government, but realize that it will suggest that because we best fulfill this metric in terms of sparking and endorsing more discourse, we've already taken this. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
So if you have a quota, who will CG prioritize between a poor man who didn't get a slot and a poor woman who did get the slot?
ostensibly ostensibly it differs across circumstances, but was suggested that, but I think TJ has already answered this with our model, to which there's an increase of men. We don't think we need to do it specifically in the model. Literally, that is incredibly cherry picking. So lastly, it's way since opening government, we suggest there is a lack of mechanization in this. It is only in TJ's speech we explain specifically as to how women is likely to be empowered. In this case, we take that above them anyways. Lastly, very quickly, the second issue here, then in terms of on which side of the house do best literally remove gender stereotypes. I think in the first issue, I've already explained why women is best empowered through the side of the discussion they're likely to spark in our side of house. I think given that, so stigmas and like stereotypes are still likely to get removed significantly better, because the factor is you interact on a daily basis with your colleagues, you better understand them, and the factor is that the relationships in the our side of house are likely to be significantly superior to your side of house, because understand that the absolute best case, because STEM industries are still male dominant anyways, so that means that on opposition side of house, the majority of interactions that are likely to happen in your life is still to interact with men, and the majority of them. So that is exactly what's only in our side of house where stereotypes are best removed for these reasons, because we best help and then alleviate the lives of women, but also because we best remove gender stereotypes. We take this round.
I would like to thank the government whip for that fine speech, and I would like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the case for side opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're on. Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So before I start, I would like to clarify I'm okay with any pronouns, and as for POIs, I would prefer POIs in voice because I might not read the chat. So if you have any POIs, just feel free to unmute and POI. And with that, okay. Give me a second. With that, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, under this situation, we first have to understand why as to the entire government bench under this situation have already lost the debate, simply because they did not mechanize any of their, simply because they did not prove as to why any of their impacts materialize in the long run. And even then, under most scenarios, it is essentially counterintuitive for them to even put quotas in the first place, simply because if you already mentioned in the opening bench that women are already losing these opportunities in STEM simply because there are men who get in there easier, and because there are men who end up getting all these opportunities instead. On the contrary, by proving that women are already oppressed under these situations, it already means that under these situations where they are in fact oppressed in these STEM industries, it is not wrong to assume that they might end up being oppressed even more, given that more men enter this industry simply because of this quota that is being set. And when this is the case, it's not just a few women losing their jobs. It is not just a few women losing this opportunity, simply because there is going to end up being a large impact on this situation, even if especially when there are not enough men joining the industry even after you put these quotas, which is something that you guys did not tackle, which is why we say that under this situation, when that is in fact the case, it is only going to end up harming it even more, which is why this case already falls. But even then, let's engage on the best case scenario of both closing government under this situation. So first of all, one of the main clashes that came up in this debate today is that it is essentially better for the industry in the long run. This is not the case. Even CG themselves have said that men are less empathetic biologically. So under this situation, right, given that they already don't have this interest to go into these fields in the first place, if you really end up shoving people who are uninterested in this subject into these fields, we say that this may only end up harming the entire industry in the long run, and not just the women who actually have interest in these jobs, simply because you're actively taking away, you're actively making it so that there is going to end up being a higher chance. And when we say a higher chance, this is not a 100% chance, because in reality, there are men who are interested in these subjects. There are men who actively opt in without even having these quotas in the first place. But even then, when these men do have interest in these subjects, they will already opt into them under our side, as to given that they already have these chances as well. And when you come up with the fact that these men are actively they will not gain the same amount of chances simply because society already told them not to do so. Well, when this is the case, and when you only open up that quota, and force these uninterested people to get in, it only adds to all the harms that I've already painted in my previous points. But even when this is the case, why does your side end up making it worse for everyone in the long run? Simply because my previous speaker has already tackled the fact that under this situation, when men are like being forced into these industries, it's only going to portray it as like, it is only going to end up portraying as like, in a sense, that these jobs aren't necessarily like even full and men aren't going in. However, under this situation, it only is going to end up further perpetuating the stereotype that only women are suitable for these jobs. Simply, and with that, the quota is only going to end up projecting these stereotypes even more, which is something that is only going to end up harming all sides in the long run. And before I move on, any POIs?
Yeah, POI LG.
Mhm.
We told you we break the stereotype because there's at least less gender dichotomy. I think there will not be a world on Gov or on Up where women are both denied from STEM and humanities, because it's not like 18th century when women are just housewives. So why is it net harm on our side?
Now, even you said that under this situation, it isn't going to be the fact that women are actively shut out from these jobs in the long run. So under this situation, right, when you tell us that we do not end up breaking the stereotype, we only say that under this situation, if only a few men are in there, since you just said that their quota is already so low, no real change is actually happening, simply because the change is extremely marginal. And when this is the case, it's only going to end up further perpetuating the stereotype, which is something that will not necessarily exist on our side, simply because we already have painted it to you as well, that women do in fact get equal chances to education in the long run as well. And what this means is that when they are able to opt into STEM as well, and like both humanities and STEM, like under this situation, that's great, because women do in fact like are going to be able to get these opportunities, given that like more developed countries already have like more policies to actively protect women in place. But when this is the case, on the contrary, on developed countries, if you're going to push this policy on a basis that also includes that of developing countries, it is only going to end up taking away more jobs from these women in those countries itself who want to opt into these fields simply because of those quotas. And when this is the case, it's only going to further harm them even more. And it perpetuates the stereotype that men are not interested in these subjects, thus we have to put these in place to actively please and favor them, which is something that only going to end up harming it even more, which is something that we don't want to have happen on our side. So on this clash on whether or not we better break the stereotype, we've already proved to you as to why this is necessarily the case. And moving on to differentiate our side from the opening bench, basically what we are able to bring to you right now is that we bring to you more analysis onto why this necessarily is the case. Since under this situation, we further prove that it is going to end up being better for women in the long run, because like it's significant to ensure that women aren't going to lose the few jobs that they still have. Like it's only going to end up losing their livelihood simply because they want to please their oppressors, which is something that we feel is inherently wrong in itself. And when that is the case, they're only going to end up having a significant portion of them losing jobs and losing safety, which was like losing safety in these fields, which they initially could have used for them to succeed in the long run. And even then, like if men do opt into these jobs as well, under our case, and under our side, we are still able to prove as to why like men are going to have like the same chances to succeed as well. And what this quota is only going to cause is an unnecessarily cut on women, which is something that we don't want to have happen. So basically what we have brought to you on our side in today's debate is that we are able to ensure that we better break this the stereotype, and that we are able to ensure that this is better for the industry in the long run. And in the long run, we say that you should side with us. And with that, I end my speech. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the opposition whip for that fine speech, and hence we conclude this debate. I would ask the speakers to leave this room.